Hello and welcome back to another Rush Duel video. Today we're going to be making a new tier list because it has been a week since the latest products, that being the mini box, Flash of Shining Flare and Selection Box 3, which have brought a few new decks into the game as well as invigorating some of the old decks, making them a little bit stronger. So this is basically coming off of the back of the World Championship qualifier, in which we did see 3 decks being very dominant, those being Light Galaxy, Spellcaster and Dark Galaxy, and we have had a restriction list since then, which did seem to somewhat gut Dark Galaxy, but leave the other two mostly unharmed. So it's not too surprising to see Light Galaxy has won 3 of the 4 tournaments since the latest product drop. Although they didn't receive any new support because they weren't really hurt, and none of the new decks are outstandingly strong, Light Galaxy has managed to secure 3 tournament wins, 5 total top 4s, which is 18 points top 4 total, but they are currently tied with Red Boot, which again, if we come down and take a look at our pie chart, has been performing really well. So although Light Galaxy has won more tournaments, in terms of actual top 4 points, they are neck and neck with 40.9% each. So very strong, with Spellcaster in 3rd place and then Elemental Hero bringing up the rear. And then if we were to push it a bit further and look at our top 8 points, Royal Rebel has actually managed to get 1 top 8 finish, which has made it kind of stand out as like the 5th deck. But with that in mind, I think it's quite easy to say that we're going to be having Light Galaxy in tier 1. Like we said, Light Galaxy was the strongest deck before the limit restriction list and before the latest box dropped. The latest box didn't give them any more support, but it didn't really make any of the other new decks that much stronger by comparison. And the limit restricted list, again, barely changed anything. So this deck feels almost untouched and is still so strong. You can still just do everything you could do before, going for that Eternal Galactica Oblivion OTK. You have a skill that just basically gets to create cards out of nothing. You have easy ways to swarm the board. The fusion monsters you can go into are very powerful. You can go into Plasma to pop back row. You can go into Plora to just fill the graveyard and keep recycling cards. This deck just kind of does a little bit of everything, and because of that, it's still just so powerful. Definitely a tier 1 deck. The next deck we're going to talk about is going to be Red Boot, because this is also going straight into tier 1. Red Boot is very powerful. It's not, I don't think, as strong as Light Galaxy, even though I think on paper it has quite a good matchup into that deck. The big thing with Red Boot is that you're always performing the same combo, which does around 6,000 damage. Because you're always doing the same combo, the deck feels very linear. There isn't really a lot of decisions to make with this deck. You're fundamentally just doing the same thing every single game, and either it will kill your opponent or it won't. But basically we can use the skill as long as we have one of our bosses in hand. Our ideal situation that we just open a Red Boot. We can get Red Boot on the board, burn our opponent for up to 700, get out our Booster Wyvern, burn for another 600, fuse them off into our Red Boot Enhanced, burn for another 18, gain a load of attack, and attack over our opponent's monsters to try and get lethal. This basically means if your opponent leaves like a 1700 or lower attack monster in attack position, they can just die out of nowhere. And with Curse of the Rising Light now introduced to the game, this means even setting 3 won't necessarily protect you from this very powerful OTK. So another really strong deck, really powerful OTK, and I think it won't be long before we see this deck winning even more tournaments. So the next deck we're going to talk about is Spellcasters, which has had 3 top 4 finishes, but hasn't been able to actually claim any wins. Spellcasters was a strong deck before the latest set and before the limit restricted list, but it was not touched whatsoever on the limit restricted list. And again, it wasn't really power crept that much by the new cards. Now obviously Red Boot has kind of overtaken, but this deck is still really strong. And because again we got brand new cards from the selection box, this deck did get a little bit of a boost. Again, Curse of the Rising Light is a really good tool to allow this deck to get damage in. The main issue Spellcasters always had is that you can use Charmy to get some piercing damage, flip something up, and that's 2 good chunks of damage in. But it just wasn't outputting the same amount of damage that Dark Galaxy and Light Galaxy could, because those decks could consistently OTK, whereas the Spellcaster deck always felt like it needed 2 turns to get all that damage in. Now with Curse of the Rising Light, if the deck does go second, you can flip one of your opponent's monsters up, summon Charmy, Charmy flip another monster up, and then pierce over the 3rd, which means we get 3 avenues to get all of that direct damage in, which is really strong and gives the deck OTK potential. The skill is also still really consistent. Being able to find one of 9 cards in the deck and then have access to an instant +1 that can also set up the graveyard is just really strong. The only real setback this deck has is, again, it's not super consistent actually OTKing. It can take a few turns to do so, and because of that, it can be a bit slower than the other decks in the meta. So the next deck we're going to talk about is Elemental Heroes, and this deck has only had a single top 4 finish, but it has had a few top 8 finishes, and the deck is actually not that bad. We're going to be having this in tier 2, and I think there is an argument to basically move these two around because they're very, very similar in power level. The Elemental Hero deck, as we have it now, is very strong, but it's a little bit inconsistent. So we're still using the old skill, which doesn't plus us. It just gives us effectively infinite access to fusion, as well as reducing our opponent's attack by a tiny amount. So it's not the best skill in the game, but the cards we got are actually really strong. We now have Shining Flare Wingman, which at first I think a lot of people thought we wouldn't be able to get this card out very easily, but because we also now have Voltic and a single copy of Miracle Fusion, actually getting out 1 or even 2 copies of Shining Flare is not too difficult. So the most powerful we've seen this deck be is when you effectively turbo out 2 Shining Flares, attack into 2 of your opponent's attack position monsters, and you basically just win the game off of that and just OTK. Now, the downside of this deck is if you don't get all the pieces you need, if you don't find all the cards you need to actually make these fusions work, it kind of falls apart. And the big problem here is Avian. In order to use almost the entire extra deck in this deck, we need to find an Avian, and if all the Avian are just on the bottom of the deck, the skill doesn't help us get there. We can play a bunch of draw cards and mill cards and basically filtering cards to try and get us to Avian, but if they're just all at the bottom of the deck, this deck isn't really doing anything, and that can be a bit of a detriment. But still a strong deck, still decent, and still tier 2. And this is where it gets a bit weird. So technically, the next deck we would put in there is Royal Rebel, but Royal Rebel, after doing some independent testing, I do not feel is a tier 3 deck. I think the only deck, again, from our testing so far and from the evidence of watching other people play and tournament results, I think Dark Galaxy is the next deck. So Dark Galaxy comes in kind of 2 flavors right now. So this is the Chrysaor Turbo with the Tearfing skill, which effectively plays just to get piercing on your guys and try and OTK your opponent out of nowhere. Now notice again, we're saying this is an OTK deck, this is an OTK deck, this is an OTK deck. We're now putting what we're considering another OTK deck into tier 3, and then this deck now can OTK. So we're on a very OTK heavy meta. If your deck can't really kill your opponent in 1 turn, a lot of the time we're asking, well, why aren't you playing a deck where you can kill your opponent in 1 turn? Because that is the meta we find ourselves in. So Tearfing is a very strong deck. The issue is your opponent can somewhat play around it, right? If they just put 1 monster in defense position, well, we're not going to get multi-attacks with Chrysaor. But you know what we can do? Just summon out 3 monsters, slap piercing on anyway, and attack our opponent for a ton of damage. So as long as your opponent doesn't have legend traps or something to protect them, this deck is really, really powerful at just closing games pretty much out of nowhere. The only issue this deck really has is it doesn't have super favorable matchups into the decks above it, and this deck gets stopped by a lot more than the other decks above it. So I would say this deck's still strong, I still really like it, but I don't think it is on the same level as Heroes and Spellcasters. So from here on, every deck is going to be a high rogue or a rogue deck. This is basically what we consider to be the meta right now. So again, anything in high rogue and rogue is not bad. It's not just like this deck is automatically terrible. Anything in high rogue and rogue can cog. Anything in high rogue and rogue can take games off of these top 5. What we are saying is, if we put these decks head to head and had them play 100 games, these decks are going to lose against the top 5 a lot more than they're going to win. So again, you can still do really, really well with anything in rogue and high rogue. They're just not as powerful as these decks. So the first one we're going to talk about is going to be Dark Galaxy. So Dark Galaxy is a strong deck in some ways still. This deck got hit really, really hard on the limit/restricted list with Void Corridor to 3, which is quite bad because that deck already had 2 limit 3s. Having 3 limit 3s really, really hurts consistency, and Void Corridor was really, really important for just making sure you could get the fusion plays going, as well as Dark Hole Device to 1, which on its own isn't the end of the world. Dark Hole Device obviously very, very powerful. That's how the deck would win most of its games. But with both Pot of Greed and Compulsory Evacuation Device also going to 1, basically meant that you can't play either of those cards in this deck. So this deck got hit substantially, which is not great for the deck itself. Now the deck is still okay. We can still go into Protostar, then from Protostar into Theogonia, then Theogonia into Chrysaor. We can still make a decent board with decent attack stats that can get some decent damage in. It's just nowhere near what it was before, and its OTK potential has gone down drastically. So because of that, I don't think we could have this any higher than High Rogue. It's still, again, it's still a playable deck, It's just nowhere near what it was, and it's nowhere near the top 5 now. And next up, we're going to have Pyro. Pyro is going to be in Rogue for me. It's still really good at getting a bunch of monsters onto the field. It's still really good at weakening your opponent's board. It's still really good at just gaining a load of advantage. And the deck doesn't feel bad to play, but there's no way this deck is OTK. Realistically, this deck is going to kill your opponent slowly. It has really good grind game, but the issue is having really good grind game doesn't really mean anything in this current meta because everyone's just OTKing each other. So if the meta did slow down, if like we had more life points, if we had more back row, if decks weren't putting out quite so much damage, I think this deck would be in a really good spot. But because that's not the case, unfortunately, Pyro not in the best spot right now. Then we have Cyber Dragon. Cyber Dragon is another weird deck. I haven't fully tested this deck yet. We haven't tried it with the cybernetic combat customization skill yet. So I don't really want to solidify where I'm putting this deck, but for now I think High Rogue does feel about right. The deck hasn't gotten a new skill, and again, it's only gotten one new card realistically, and that is going to be the Cyber Processor. Processor is still really, really good, but I think the deck does need a new skill before it can be really, really strong. This is still a High Rogue deck, I think. I think it can still win games against some of the stronger decks, but I don't think it's in a fantastic position in the meta right now. Then we have another deck that I haven't thoroughly tested yet. So this is Jointech, and I've heard good things about Jointech. I've heard that Jointech is actually not in a awful spot, but again, I haven't really tested it. It hasn't seen any tournament success. Realistically, the new skill doesn't look super crazy good, but again, I'm going to put this in high expectations. Maybe this will be a little bit better in the future, but as for right now, this is going to be sitting in High Rogue. And then we have Dragon Fusion. This is probably my least favorite deck in the game, and I don't think it's in a great spot right now. This is again a deck that is a little bit slow. You kind of have to wait for your opponent to leave themselves exposed, and then you get to try and OTK your opponent, and it is still a deck that can OTK. But this is a deck that typically either has to really, really high roll, or your opponent has to play into it, whereas a lot of the other decks that are actually tiered here, they can basically do the same thing, but they don't need to wait for that turn for your opponent to like play into it. You can just kind of do it. So by that logic, it just kind of feels like Dragon Fusion is similar to the other decks here, but just worse. So that's why it's going to be in Rogue. Then we have Draonic, and Draonic is another interesting deck. This deck can pop your opponent's back row and has lots of ways to gain a lot of advantage, but does have a lot of monsters with 0 defense, and that can be a bit of a liability, especially since we do still have Charmy Witch running around. You can just change those monsters to defense and pierce over them. We also have other piercing decks in the game right now, such as the Chrysaor Turbo and the Tear thing. We also have Leica, who again can just pierce over, so there's a lot of like scary piercing options at the moment, so I don't think this deck is in the best position right now in the current meta. Then we have Baseball. Baseball, I think, is in a bit of a weird spot as well. We have said in the past that I think Baseball is similar to Pyro, but maybe a little bit worse, but actually I think Baseball has a better chance to OTK and to close games quickly when compared to Pyro, so I think that does give it a bit of an edge in this current meta. I still don't think this deck is super strong or anything, but again, you can cog with this deck. We cog with this deck. You could definitely top a tournament with this deck if you get a little bit lucky. It's just not going to be winning more often than it's going to be losing against the top decks. And next up, we're going to talk about Royal Rebels. Royal Rebels is a bit of a weird deck. It's hard to know where to place this. I think Royal Rebels it's a deck that will do better the luckier you are and the worse your opponent is. Because if your opponent isn't playing around the Royal Rebels, this deck can absolutely pop off and can get so much damage in. And again, if you just get a little bit lucky, if you like go second, for example, you open Curse of the Rising Light, you can flip your opponent's guys up, and then you can go into Doom, because you just got everything you needed to get Doom off. It feels really, really strong. The issue is, those things aren't going to happen all that often. So I don't think I could put Royal Rebels any higher than High Rogue. This deck is still very fun to play. It's still very enjoyable. Again, you can cog with this list. It already has top to tournament, so theoretically it's going to be able to keep doing that. But I don't think it can be any higher than High Rogue. And then we have Psychic, and I think Psychic is going to go somewhere around here, somewhere near the bottom of High Rogue. I think Psychic is a bit of a weird deck right now. You have the ability to gain life points, which is reasonably quite nice, especially since most decks are trying to OTK you. If you can get out of OTK range, that can be really advantageous. I think specifically this is going to be an okay deck into like maybe like Galaxy. The issue is a lot of these decks can like get to about 6,000, maybe 7,000 damage, and then they kind of stop. So Psychic will be able to like outlast some of these decks. The issue is Psychic isn't always able to just OTK on the crackback, and if you're not doing that, then realistically the deck isn't going to do anything, because what's the point of surviving an extra turn if you can't do anything with an extra turn? If you're just going to die on the following turn, why does it matter if you can survive a turn? But this deck is still theoretically quite strong. You can still get a lot of life point gain, you can reduce the attack of all your opponent's monsters and boost your own. Theoretically, this deck can output over 6,000 damage, so could be in an interesting spot if they can survive the onslaught from your opponent. But again, the skill is fine, but it's not great. The skill doesn't really do anything unfair, and I think that's something we're starting to see, is we're starting to see skill power creep with a lot of these stronger decks. Now, realistically, only one of these skills in the top 3 is not like a really, really strong skill, and that is the hero skill. And the only reason that deck is up here is because the quality of card they got is just so powerful. We're starting to see that a lot of these decks that are in High Rogue and Rogue are down here just because their skill hasn't been updated enough, or they're just kind of missing something that they need to get that extra leg up over the rest of the competition. But there are some other decks that we could throw in. We could just throw them into like Rogue, but we don't really want to just be talking about basically every single deck in the game. Realistically, I think these are the decks that are really going to matter. These are all the decks that you potentially are going to run into on your cog climb, or you might see in a tournament. I think overall this is a pretty good, accurate-ish representation of the meta. I think you could easily drop the Tier Thing deck down into High Rogue, or leave it in Tier 3. I think it is notably a little bit better than the decks beneath it. It's definitely a lot weaker than the decks above it. So if in your opinion this deck should be in High Rogue, I completely agree with that. I just think it is a little bit better than the decks underneath it. But tell me what you think down below in the comments, because I want to know, where do you think these decks are? Do you think anything in here is massively wrong? Is there any deck that you think I've put too low? Any deck you think I've put too high? Any deck I haven't spoken about that you think should have been mentioned? I would love to hear about it. But thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you next time.